Matthew chapter 8. We're going to read in verse 18, then we're going to jump down to verse 23. And we're going to read all three accounts of this particular series of events in the life of Jesus and his disciples, because there are some nuances to these that I think will be helpful to us as we make our way through this text. And verse 18, you'll find out later. Verse 18 is critical to answering one of the questions in the at the end of the book, and so because it's not expressly stated in the lesson itself, you have to read the text in order to answer the question. And in verse 18 of Matthew 8 it says, "And when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side." Now, down to verse 23. There's a little interlude there between him and another individual, but we want to get to the primary part of our account where it says, "Now when Jesus got into a boat, his disciples followed him. And suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with waves, but he was asleep. Then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, 'Lord, save us, we are perishing.' But he said to them, 'Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?' And he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, 'Who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him?'" All right, now over to Mark chapter 4. And picking up in verse 35. "On the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us cross over to the other side.' Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' Then he rose and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, 'Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?' And they feared exceedingly, and said to one another, 'Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Now Luke 8. And beginning in verse 22. "Now it happened on a certain day that he got into a boat with his disciples. He said to them, 'Let us cross over to the other side of the lake.' And they launched out. But as they sailed, he fell asleep, and a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, 'Master, Master, we are perishing.' Then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And he said to them, 'Where is your faith?' And they were afraid and marveled, saying to one another, 'Who can this be? For he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him.'" Now, there are some interesting things, I think, in each one of the texts that are important for us to think about. Even though they're not necessarily mentioned in the lesson, we'll talk about some of these things as we go forward. But we're looking at in this section here under the introduction. It says, it says in the third paragraph. Well, let me go to the second paragraph. It says, "These passages above start the completion of the account of what we are calling Christ's busy day." It says, "Remember that it started with the accusations from the Jews and will end with Jesus withdrawing to the east side of the Sea of Galilee." It says, "And before we get to the scriptures, consider some questions. What are some normal storms in nature, and what are some general characteristics of storms?" It talks about changes of intensity, difficulty in prediction, not wanting to be out in them, and then what are storms that people face today. And so we're going to draw some parallels between some of these characteristics of storms, and then almost treat them like parables. Now, it's things that we can learn about storms. We can also learn about how we are to live our lives and things that we can think about and expect during the course of our lives. And so, looking at the text, and by the way, we know that he was going. We know where he was. Thus, we know he was going to the east side of what is called the Sea of Galilee. Because if we kept reading, we would find that when he got to the other side, it says he was in the land of the Gerasenes, or sometimes it might say Geradenes. There are a couple of nuances to the name, and that's where. And our next lesson, lesson 40, is that account where he dealt with the man possessed with so many demons that he was referred to as Legion. And the Gerasenes or Gadarenes was on the east shore of the Sea of Galilee. So we know he was going from west. He was going from west to east. And the Bible says that he's doing this, and keep this in the back of your mind. He was doing this because of the great multitudes that were there. All right, and so there seems to be, like, if you're thinking about it, there might be some things that we need to consider, like why would Jesus leave a huge crowd of people and go, across the sea to another place? And some things we want to think about. Now, thinking about in the third or the second paragraph that says that Christ was asleep in the stern on a cushion. And the stern is the rear of the boat. The boat has, any sailing vessel has 4 directions, I guess, so to speak. All right, there's the bow, which is the what? It's the front, and then the stern is the back, and the left is what? Fore and aft. And so Jesus is in the stern of the boat, which means he's in the backside of the boat. And note also that the text said there were other little boats with them. We don't have any idea about the size of this boat. I would assume, and this is just an assumption, that this boat may have been in some way connected to the disciples fishing. Because Peter and James and John and Andrew, they were all fishermen by trade, and we know that their boat was of some consequence in order to be big enough to cast nets out of, and we also know that it was small enough that they could catch enough fish to cause the boat to sink. And so trying to determine exactly the size of the boat would be difficult. But we do know this, there was 13 people in it, and one of them had enough room in the back of it to go to sleep. And so that's about all we've got. And then I did some research, I tried to research, because some of the texts say there were other little boats with them. And I tried to do some research on that word, and I couldn't find anything in the text to indicate that the word there meant little. In other words, the idea that they were little boats was something that was a matter of translation opinion. Because if you read, for example, if you're reading in the New King James or King James, you read about little boats. But if you're reading, for example, in the ESV, it just says boats. And that's the best I could come up with was boats. And I don't know why the designation of little. Sir? It could. But again, the word's just not in there. It just says I think the word's plonia. And the ending there just simply makes it a plural. Now, they were in a ploinois, which is a singular boat. That's the word in the singular form. And plonia is the plural form. And so there's no reference, there's no adjective to tell us about the size of the boats, but we do know there were other boats with them. All right, and so we do have that, and we're going to come back to that point also as well. Now we note in the third paragraph under Jesus calms the storm, that this storm is of such consequence that waves are coming over the side of the boat. And of course, we know, these boats were, again, if we're assuming that this was a boat that was used to fish out of, you might expect that there would be, for lack of a better term, a cutaway on the sides. In other words, the boat wouldn't be as tall all the way down the sides, because you've got to get the net out and the net over. So the boat, likely had some type of cutaway on the sides where you can work. Okay, but whatever's going on here, this thing's taking on water, and it's taking on water fast. And, and again, if you think about a cutaway, it wouldn't take a big wave to bring water into the boat, but when you do have big waves, it's a serious matter. And so this boat is filling up, and it is filling up quickly. Now, just a quick thing about this storm, that the storm arose. This has almost completely 100% to do with geography. All right? And that is that the Sea of Galilee is the lowest freshwater sea on the planet. In other words, the level of the water on the Sea of Galilee is the lowest of any freshwater sea on the entire planet. It's 700 feet below sea level. Right? The lowest body of water on the planet is the Dead Sea, which the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River flows into the Sea of Galilee and out of the Sea of Galilee, and then into the Dead Sea, which is about 50 miles long and like 20 miles wide. And the surface of the Dead Sea is almost 1,400 feet below sea level. But because of its place being so far below sea level, when air temperatures would drop, it would create currents. By the way, I didn't even know about this until a few years ago. I've always wanted to elk hunt, like in Colorado. I've always wanted to go out and elk hunt in the mountains. And one thing I learned some years ago about reading about hunting is that depending on whether or not it's morning or evening depends on where you are on the mountain. Because of that very thing, that wind currents, when air cools or heats up, it creates, for human beings, almost undetectable wind currents. But for an animal that can smell, like a deer or an elk, it can carry your scent halfway up the mountain, and that animal will be gone before you ever know that it's there. Well, that's the same principle here. These air currents would be created when cool air would meet warm air, and it would just fall down. It would create these currents, and it would just rush down the sides of the mountains into the sea and create, a huge disturbance in a hurry. Now, the Sea of Galilee is let's see, it's not appropriately named, right? It's not a sea. We have a lot of lakes that are bigger than the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is 13 miles long and 7 miles wide. It's a giant. It's essentially a lake. Lake Tahoe is about half and again bigger than the Sea of Galilee out in the desert. All right. So you just had this body of water that's in a depressed area, and these winds would come down, and all of a sudden it just stirs this whole thing up in a heartbeat. Right? And it happens suddenly. And these types of things still happen, even on larger bodies of water today. You think about Paul's journey when he was shipwrecked. These sailors, they knew what the odds were, but they thought that the weather was working their way, and they didn't no more get out of sight of land, and that nor'easter came. And ended up driving them, for weeks out, for over 2 weeks they were adrift in the sea. So, we understand that these things can happen, they can happen in a hurry. And they can be extremely intense. Just think about some of the weather that we have, particularly in the summer, late spring, summer, early fall, when what was yesterday was the anniversary of the tornadoes, right, in Hackleburg and other places. But there were places not very far from here that didn't get touched at all, right? I mean, we had there was the series of tornadoes. Even before that, like the ones that hit Carbon Hill a number of years ago, Nauvoo across there. These storms can be very intense and yet very isolated. I mean, we even saw like one house in Hackleburg destroyed and the next one right next to it, basically completely unscathed. And so we're talking about an extremely intense storm. You're in a boat, you're on an open body of water, and this is a serious matter. Right? I mean, I'm just trying to explain to you that this was a life or death. In their minds, this was a life or death situation. And here's Jesus asleep in the back of the boat in the midst of this raging, it says fierce, a fierce gale arose. And Jesus is asleep on the back of this boat. Now, as we move over to the bottom of the page, over to the top of the next page, the question is, at the bottom of the page, what did they expect Jesus to do? What did they expect him to do? And we'll talk a little bit about that, but the point is, when Jesus did something, they couldn't believe what he did. I mean, they believed, it wasn't that they didn't believe it, they couldn't believe that somebody could do what Jesus did. And so when they asked him to save them, again, this is just a thought question. What do you think? What do you think that they thought? What did they have? What did they have in mind? And then in the first full paragraph, it says, once they woke him up, he rebuked the disciples. And in Matthew 8:26, he says, "Why are you afraid, O ye, you men of little faith?" Note in verse 26 that the rebuke of those men came before he calmed the storm. In our mind, you might think, well, he got up and he calmed the storm, and then he would turn around and rebuke them, right? But he rebuked them while the storm was still raging. I think it's an interesting series of events. He rebuked them in the midst of the storm, and then he calmed the storm. And there may be a lesson for us there as well. But then note in that paragraph, and I'd not thought about this until I was looking at this lesson, is that not only did everything stop, it says, one of the accounts says there was a great calm. A great calm. You think about being on a boat, being at the lake, and the water just looks like glass. It's just so peaceful. The water is so calm that if a mayfly or something lands on it, you can actually see the ripple of a small fly that might touch the water. And that's the situation here. We got waves crashing over the boat one minute, and we have a sea of glass the next minute. It didn't just say it was calm. What I'm saying, it was a great calm, which shows that the waves didn't, it wasn't the fact that the wind stopped and then the waves slowed. You know what it's like if you're on the lake and somebody goes blowing by you, and the first set of waves hit you, and then there's a second set, and then there's a third set, and then finally after about 3 or 4 good rocks, it levels out. In this case, none of that. Just boom, sea of glass. Sea of glass. So the wind stopped and the waves completely dissipated in a moment's time, in an instant. So it's a great calm. And then it says, they said, "What kind of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him. Again, going back to the question, what did they expect of Jesus? And I want to know one thing that's in Mark's account. All right, Matthew's account says he rebuked the winds and the sea. Luke's account says he rebuked the winds and the sea. But look at Mark's account. Go back to Mark 4. And look at verse 39. Mark gives us a little more details here. In other words, instead of doing one thing that's encompassed in two places, wind and sea, what does Mark's account say that Jesus did? He first what? He rebuked the wind, and then what? Said to the sea. He rebuked the wind and then said to the sea. In other words, he rebuked the wind and the wind stopped, and then he spoke to the sea and the waves calmed.
Once the weather stopped, it would take a minute for it to go. But it had no power on its own without the wind, so it was just being still, and all of a sudden it's just like the reaction time.
That's right. But I think that gives us the indication that there were still waves as soon as he rebuked the wind, but then he just spoke to the sea and said, "Peace, be still." And then boom, there was a great calm. And I had never, look, it's one of those things, I can't tell you how many times I've read the Gospel of Mark. I can't tell you how many times I've read this particular account, and it never jumped out at me that it says he did two different things. He rebuked the wind and he spoke to the water. And both of them did exactly what he said to do. It's instant. That's right. Yeah. When he said, "Peace, be still," it's just like, just like that, the sea just went dead calm. Not a dissipation of waves, but an instantaneous elimination of the waves. Because if you think about it, we don't know how far out, but waves, will hit something and then they work their way back. But there's a great calm in this particular case. So now we ask this question. Now this is in the second look, and I think the author of the lesson drew too much out of this, and I'll explain why. Says, when the storm came, Jesus was asleep, and it makes us wonder why he was able to sleep. And I think the answer is just simply he was exhausted. Jesus was exhausted. When you read, and by the way, it's not just that he was exhausted from the previous day. We start reading about the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7. We start reading about all the miracles that are being performed, beginning in chapter 8. There's a litany of miracles that are taking place, and not just like singular miracles, but like where it says multitudes came to Jesus and he healed them all. And we also made note when we studied that it wasn't like that Jesus just conferred the miracle on everybody. He healed each individual person. That's the intent of the text. So Jesus is exhausted, not just because of one day. It's because of a series of days that have just been, it's just that daylight to dark situation. And so I think it's simply because he was exhausted. Now, in the second line it says, and this is the author's take, says, it also had to do with the fact that he is God. And that's true too. But what I'm thinking about is, and it probably had something to do with his faith in his Father. And I think that reads too much into the text, because Jesus is already asleep before the storm. And the Bible doesn't say that he woke up during the storm and just said, oh, it's just a storm, and went back to sleep. Like we might do. Oh, I woke up. I heard thunder. I woke up. Oh, it's a storm. I go back to sleep. Of course, a lot of people around here don't go back to sleep. They go turn their weather radio on and they sit up with it half the night. I'm not one of those people. I go back to sleep. But Jesus didn't awake during the storm and go back to sleep. He just didn't wait. You see what I'm saying by this? He was asleep and he was still asleep. It wasn't like he was asleep and woke up and then decided, hey, it's all still good, I'm just going to go back to sleep. So that's why I think the lesson reads a little bit too much into it. And then in the next paragraph it talks about he rebuked the disciples, called them men of little faith, and then the last question, we'll talk about this in just a moment. Looking at these events, how do these things help us going forward? But I want to look at a word for a minute. And this is the word that's found in all the accounts in Mark 4 and 41, in Matthew 8 and verse 27, and in Luke 9. Luke 8. In Luke 8 and verse 25, and that is the word obey. Obey. Even the winds and the sea obey him. I want to think about the word obey. It's a compound word in the original language. Actually, it's like a preposition and a verb put together. The preposition is hupo, which means under. The second half of the word is akao or akuo, which is the word for listening. Not just hearing, listening. And so the word here for obey means to listen under. And what that means is that one listens in submission to the one who is speaking. You see it? To listen under. What is also necessarily implied in that? I mean, it's found in the word obey, but what is it? It's doing it, right? I mean, for example, your children can recognize that you are the authority, and they can hear you. But they don't obey until they do what is said. In other words, there is the exercise of free will, where one says, you have the right to tell me to do this, and when you tell me to do this, I'm obligated to do it. And that's what obedience is. Obedience is doing something in the way that you're told to do it because you recognize the authority of the one who is telling you to do that thing. So to listen under. I thought about, here's some passages that came to mind. In Acts 6 and verse number 7, it says, a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. These are priests who were in the Jewish system they were not only in the Jewish system, they were practitioners, priests in the Jewish system, and it says they were obedient to the faith. In other words, the new covenant. In other words, they left the covenant that they were under because they recognized the authority that was telling them, you need to leave this and do this. In Romans 10 and verse 16, Paul makes this lamentation. He says, but they have not all obeyed the gospel. Obeyed the gospel. People want to argue about, well, the gospel's just the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. They'll go to 1 Corinthians 15. Where Paul says, moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel that I preached to you, which you also received, you believe, and you stand in it. And then Paul lists the basic facts of the gospel, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, buried and raised the third day, also according to the Scriptures. And people say, well, there's the gospel. Paul defines what the gospel is. But earlier in Romans 10 and 16, he says a person has to obey the gospel. Right? They've not all obeyed the gospel. So what does that tell me? It tells me that obedience to the gospel is more than just believing a set of facts. That there is a submissiveness on my part that has to take place in response to hearing and believing the gospel. It's not just a matter of me believing it. I'm obligated to do some things. Else, the gospel makes demands on us. Else there's no way you can obey it. You cannot obey a set of facts. You can only believe a set of facts. You can only obey when you're placed under an obligation to do something. And so, in order to obey the gospel, there's something involved in the gospel that I have to respond to and do. Oh wait, Peter said this, what will be the end of those who obey not the gospel of God? 2 Thessalonians 1:8, Jesus will in flaming fire take vengeance on them who do not know God and do not obey the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. So the gospel is more than just a set of facts. There's an obligation placed on us in view of those facts. And by the way, we could look at Mark 16:16, go and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. There's the onus, there's the obligation. Believe and be baptized. Philip preached Jesus to the eunuch. Acts 8 and verse 35. And in the very next verse, he says, see, here's water. What hinders me to be baptized? In other words, preaching, the preaching of the gospel, the preaching of Jesus, incite, and I use the word incites in its purest sense, motivates people to be baptized. Okay, because that is an obligation of the gospel and of preaching Jesus. And you can look at the same in Acts 8 and verses 5 through 12. Jesus is the author of eternal salvation to all them that obey Him. Listen under. All those who listen under, He's the author of eternal salvation. If they listen under, what's it mean? They do what He says. They do what He says. But now I want to think for a moment about what happened to the other boats. The Bible makes absolutely no mention of the other boats. What happened to the other boats? Have you ever thought about that? Probably a lot of questions. But I mean, in my mind, I'm like, there's no way those boats capsized and all those people died. I mean, I'm just not willing to accept that as a fact in this case, or even as a speculation. I just can't believe that people trying to follow Jesus in a boat had their boat capsized and got drowned. Right? Yeah, I'm more inclined to place this along the lines of Jonah and the city of Nineveh, where there was a great sign, and then somebody came along later and explained what had happened. Right? I mean, I think word got out about Jonah before he got to Nineveh, because he only preached an 8-word sermon. Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. I mean, if he's just some itinerant preacher that nobody's ever heard of or knew, that response doesn't make sense. But if people understood that's the dude that got ate by a fish, and got spit up on the shore, I might be really inclined to listen to that guy. Well, I'm thinking along those same lines. I'm thinking these people experienced something that they had no explanation for. We were trying to follow Jesus, and a storm blew up, and we were in fear. We were in fear for our lives, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, what? Just stopped. without explanation. But then what? Think that word might have got out? Do you think that when they got to the other side that the disciples told some people about those things? Do you think the word probably got out? In other words, in a later situation, that may have been a source of great faith in those people who followed Jesus. Because they knew what had happened. They just didn't know why it had happened. But then when you find out why it had happened, because of Jesus, then it's a whole different matter, not just some type of crazy coincidence. And then I thought about this one. Again, I'm thinking about the other boats. All right. Again, I don't know if I would call this conjecture, but I think it's a lesson that we could draw if we're going to assume the other boats made it. All right. And we're going to assume that. And that's this. Other people are blessed. Let me put it this way. People in other boats are blessed when Jesus is in your boat. Is that right? Other people in other boats are blessed when Jesus is in your boat. All right, now let's draw a direct parallel. We're talking about a storm, right? And deliverance from a storm. Right? And Christians find deliverance in Christ, right? We find deliverance from sin and those types of things, but we also find deliverance from the storms of life, right? Now, can other people who are involved in storms be blessed by us because Jesus was in our boat and calmed the storm? I mean, there's a million ways that thing could manifest itself. And so that's just something I thought about, that assuming the other boats made it, they were blessed because Jesus was in somebody else's boat. Jeremiah.
He was trying to get away from the multitudes. The storm could have caused the other boats to turn back as well.
That may be true too. They may have turned back. Or, and I hadn't even considered this, Jeremiah, it may be the case that storm was so isolated that the other boats never experienced a storm.
Well, my thinking was, if he calmed the seas and the wind, could he calm the seas and the wind where they were at too?
That was my original thought, was that whatever blessing was received by the apostles and in their boat was also received. He didn't just calm it for them; he calmed it. Period. But again, thinking about the intensity of a storm or how it's isolated. Again, if you talking about 13 by 7, the Sea of Galilee is 13 by 7 miles, 13 miles by 7. You can go 13 miles dead south of here and have a terrible storm and the sun be shining. Well, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to Rhonda and she's like, man, it is storming here in town and I'm out here in the garden, and I'm just burning up because the sun's, beating me down. That's 8 or 9 miles. And so, it could be the case that they were not affected by the storm. I mean, it's possible just because of the magnitude or the size of the lake, relatively speaking. But I just got to thinking about that others are blessed when we have Jesus in our boat. Let us do good unto all men, Galatians 6 and verse 10. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor and work with his hands, that he might provide for him who is in need, Ephesians 4 and verse 28. In other words, when people do what Jesus tells them to do, others become the recipients of that obedience. 2 Corinthians 9, 12 to 15, where the relief was sent to the needy saints. It said it relieved all the needs of the saints and everybody else around them. And because of that, those people the text indicates those people also praised God for the work of the Macedonians and those Gentiles. And so I just thought about the lesson, that other people are blessed when we have Jesus in our boat. All right, so now what we'll do is, Lord willing, next week we'll run the questions. and then start on lesson plan 40. And I made a mention of this in the bulletin. We're going to change gears. Rather than continue this study with a new notebook, I've already got the notebooks and the early lessons copied. We're going to switch. We're going to switch to a book called The Beginning of Our Confidence. And I got copies. I've got copies for everybody. We'll hand them out probably next week. I give every new Christian here gets one of these as a general rule. And it's designed, it's 49 lessons, it's one lesson a day for 7 weeks. But what we're going to do is we're going to take one day's lesson and make it 1 week. And we're going to spend the next year in this book when we finish lesson 40. This is going to do a number of things. Number one, we have so many new Christians that we need to help ground in the faith. And then we've got young Christians, our young people need these basic lessons as well. And it'll help us maintain a continuity on Sunday morning for an entire year. Like if I'm going in a week in a meeting, Kyle can teach whatever the next lesson is. In other words, we won't have it. We won't have any interruptions in the lessons, like jumping from this to this, and then maybe the next week something else. This will provide some continuity for our Bible class. So I'll get these handed out probably next week.